Okay, everyone, welcome to the second online lecture. I don't have any music because I'm really worried about YouTube actually taking all my stuff and not letting me post it. But today we're talking about the market revolution. This is really important, so make sure you're taking good notes. Feel free to pause, feel free to put on the subtitles. You'll see all my ums as I talk, but you really need to know the information that you learn in this slide. I would also write down the dates, so we're talking right after the Revolution to the middle of the 1800s. So, the market revolution is pretty important for a couple of reasons. The first is it is the creation of a new economy. So instead of having a colonial economy, there is a new economy afoot. This became a thing due to innovation in transportation and communication. Before the market revolution, if you were living in like Boston or something, you would go down the street to your local artisan or shoe cobbler or whatever and buy your stuff. The market revolution changed it so that that the average person could now buy the mass production of goods. So you would have factories producing more things. The local artisans were still around, but their goods were considered like special goods, right? Whereas this is like big deal kind of stuff. So you had more products, and then you had the increase in transportation, as you see in some of these pictures, which meant that you had a better way to get the products. Changes in transportation. The first is the steamboat. Oops, let's go back to where we have the new inventions. So the steamboat, you see a picture right here. You also saw a picture in the other one. It's pretty significant because it is a boat that is powered by steam, which meant it could travel against the current. So for example, the Mississippi River flows north, I'm pretty sure. You could have that traveling south. So where you could have it traveling against the current of a river, which means you can get to places faster. You also had the invention of canals and railroads. You also just had more companies building roads. So different states within the Union were like, man, it really takes like 50 million years to get around. Let's make it a little easier. So they would hire out companies to build roads to make it easier. One of the biggest things that happened is this Erie Canal right here. This is in upstate New York, and it created so you could have easy access transportation between New York City and the Great Lakes. So more and more goods could come into New York City, not coming from the Atlantic Ocean side. This created new cities, for example, Buffalo, New York, and it also led to the greater creation of New York City to like what we see it as today, right? More and more people were moving there. That was the hub of where everything was going. The last thing that you have that was invented was the telegraph. Not the telephone, but somewhat similar, but you could transfer over information almost instantaneously, which meant people would be more connected with each other. This is pretty important when you're thinking about transporting goods, right? Like you want to be able to say if you're in this factory, like, hey, this stuff's going to get to you at this time, and let them know that without waiting for a month for a letter to come. The increase in transportation encouraged the movement west. So this is where you see the term manifest destiny come into play. This idea that Americans were divinely appointed to settle the West and spread freedom, and by that spread freedom to other lands that are not theirs, so any territory that's Spain's, Mexico's, or Native American territory, and try to like take that over. At the end of the day, though, the movement west was more financial, trying to think about getting more land, because land is power, having more opportunity to be a part of this market. So they're moving west of the Appalachian Mountains, which are right about here. So you see the creation of states such as Mississippi, Alabama, Ohio, Illinois, Arkansas, all of like these big places here. Plus with the Louisiana Purchase, right? Like there was more land. A lot of these people, as you can see here, would go to land and basically just squat on the land. It was land that wasn't even theirs. It wasn't even the U.S., but so many people were convinced that like they would find their pursuit of happiness or whatever heading out west. So they just kind of squatted there, and there was a rise in the population of the West. This began a debate, argument, question about slavery. which will be a bigger question, but the movement west is one of the most foundational reasons there became an argument about the cause of slavery. They're even tried to create some sort of random boundary for slavery, like right about here, but it didn't quite last, and we'll talk about why. The technological innovation almost put socially the U.S. in sort of backwards place. So the New England factories relied on textiles. They created like textile factories, which basically means they made clothes. They needed cotton to do that, but cotton is like really labor intensive, really hard to pick and plant. And so a lot of people would argue that like before the market revolution, slavery was going to be kind of dying out. They didn't have the agricultural need for slavery anymore until the invention of this thing here, the cotton gin. So the cotton gin made it easier to separate the seed from cotton, which meant you needed to pick more cotton to get more cotton to separate in the cotton gin. So in the southern states, where right around here where it is, the temperature, the environment was perfect for growing cotton. More and more people moved there, more and more people took more land, and increased the rise in slavery because it was more efficient to pick cotton that way to put in the cotton gin. So essentially, New England's need for cotton for their textiles made them need cotton from the South, which made southern plantation owners, or in general anybody, increase slavery because of how labor intensive it is for cotton. The international slave trade, so anything like crossing over the Atlantic, was banned. However, because of the rise in cotton, you saw a lot of internal slave trading and like the creation of, this is like a horrible way to explain it, I suppose, but creating slavery and more slavery, right? Like forever binding families together so that they will always stay slaves and like decreasing the amount of slaves that are able to be free. The key here is that everyone relied on slavery. So the South is were the states who instituted the institution, right, and allowed it to happen, created laws around it. But New England turned a blind eye, New England or people up north, because they really needed the cotton for their textile factories. Cool. Next, you have the market society. Sorry, I was just testing something. So let's talk about how the market revolution changed society. First things first, there was less of a reliance on farming or self-sustaining farming, which led to moving to the city. So instead you have these big, massive farms, farming and getting a lot of food, transporting it to the city because transportation's easier and they don't have to wait 50 billion years for a bell pepper. And that means more people were able to work and move to the city. You had a lot of farmers because they needed to grow more food and transport more food, get loans from banks, and so that's the first time you see like banks also starting to rise to give out loans. You also see the growth of different cities in the Midwest closer to farming societies, so that's where railroads become important, for example, Chicago or St. Louis. A lot of people moved for jobs, and that's the biggest thing, biggest sort of change. Okay, so, let me go back real quick. The thing is that the type of jobs that they worked also changed. So if you were making clothes, for example, before the market revolution, you had to be pretty skilled. Like you had to be pretty good at that needle. You had to really know what to do. Because you now have machines that do the work for you, not all of the work, like you still have to do a lot of labor-intensive work, you are considered what is an unskilled worker. So that means you can go in, you don't get paid as much as someone who's making clothes from hand, but you don't also need the same like formal education that everyone else needs. This is pretty important because this is why you start to see more people moving to working, and everything's founded or centered around these machines. I was moving my hands as if you guys could see them. Centered around these machines, right? And so what the industry people focused on, banks, people in power, people with money, was like making these machines more efficient, less on the worker and making the worker more efficient, if that makes sense. Let's talk about who was working in factories. So obviously you have young men. A lot of young men are moving to these factories and working in them. But the key thing with the workers is what mattered more was the amount of time, not the quality. So you were paid based on how much time you worked, not necessarily about the product that you worked on. So this is where you see some like crazy sort of work hours, like 12-hour days. People are on their feet all day. Their wage, they're not getting paid very much because the quality of the product's not very good. But it did give people an opportunity to get a lot of work as well. Some big things to notice. This picture is full of women working. And you have what is known as mill girls. So a lot of the time it's single women, immigrant women, women who are not married, but they still need to have some sort of job, so they would go work in these factories. Was it by any means a way of like economic freedom for them? Not really. They were paid often more or less than men. They often had to live in boarding homes where the men didn't, and in these boarding homes they were told to be like religious and not date people and all this fun stuff. But it did give a chance for a good amount of women, if they were single, to go out and work in the factories. Now, once they had a family, that changed. Sometimes they still worked, but most of the time it was to sustain their family, and that's it. You also have immigrants working. So this is where we start to see a rise in immigration from Europe to the Americas because the demand for labor was so high. They needed more immigrants to come in and work. So if you look here, right, you see boom, 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 things just keep going up for immigration. It goes down a little bit, but here at the peak is when labor was needed in these factories for these unskilled workers. Most immigrants were coming from Ireland or Germany, and most of them moved to the northern states, so like New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and some to the Midwest. As always in U.S. history, when immigrants comes in, everyone decides to freak out. For example, there was a lot of propaganda against Irish immigrants. A lot of Irish immigrants were coming over due to a potato famine. And when they came over, they often were like living in, they call them tenements. I think that's a nice way to say like really rough housing. If you go to New York, you can see it. But where like 10 people are shoved into a one-bedroom apartment, nothing's being cleaned up in the city. It's like a pretty gruesome place to live. And then you have the rise in nativism. So that's essentially U.S. natives, quote unquote U.S. natives, saying that like, oh, they're ruining our culture, they're ruining our history if we let these Irish immigrants over. Going back to previously what you learned, contextualization, Catholics and Protestants, that was what England used to fuel their need for colonization. Protestant beliefs are pretty deeply seated in U.S. culture because it was founded by Protestants. So the natives, or the people in the nativist party, or nativism, use the Catholic versus Protestant sort of thing to say that Catholics from Ireland are threatening our freedom, they're going to make the Pope take over, blah, 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 to the point where it was like literally a political party, and their platform was freedom from Catholicism. Point being here is that there was quite a bit of discrimination when it came to immigrants. Now let's talk about the privileged people. So the, average wealthy white man who was educated really liked the market revolution. It spurred this idea of individualism, and you see this in a couple of different ways. The first is transcendentalism. So this is like an art movement. It's a literature movement as well. But it's this idea that you can remake your life. Like you have so many opportunities to do what you want to do. And choosing the individual over sort of community and traditions, like I'm an individual, I'm going to move out west, I'm going to live on this land, I'm going to write about nature, blah, blah, blah. And this idea of self-reliance, like I can only rely on myself to take care of myself and make sure I'm living the life that I want. The government can't do that. Traditions can't do that. Again, I'm maybe like being a bit, sarcastic about it, but I do want to name that like this is a privileged sort of thing. The rise of individualism is coming from these men who are able to just like pick up and think about life things like this, which in reality is not a significant portion of the people who were living during the market revolution times. Cool. So let's talk about the limits of liberty or individualism in the market economy. The biggest thing I'm going to focus on for this slide is slavery because it is clearly the biggest thing. So I want to jump back to contextualize again. The U.S. history has this belief of the American dream, and you start to see this coming from the market revolution. Like if you just work real hard and if you make yourself, you'll make it, right? And that's like what the Puritans believed too for getting to heaven. So this rhetoric is happening, but at the same time you have select groups of people not being given the privilege or the opportunity to live out the American dream. And the first would be slaves. So during the Market Revolution, there were different categories of Black Americans. First are slaves, right? And slavery increased due to the need for cotton and the need to move it quickly and faster. So in the South, you have a literal economy of slave trade. That's a big part of the Southern economy. And that, like in this picture here, like this is pretty horrendous to see, but essentially like taking children from their mothers and fathers, selling them off to someone else. Like that is the economy that has been made. If you were a Black American back then and you were not a slave, you were considered free, maybe you live in the northern states where there's no slavery, there's still a significant amount of discrimination. So first thing is the type of neighborhoods that Black Americans were told they had to live in were very different than whites. The type of schools and the type of jobs. So a lot of the white Americans in the northern cities were like, oh, we hate slavery, we think it's bad, but they were worried about the competition they would have if they opened up the market to everyone else. So a lot of Blacks who were free had a harder time getting jobs in the north. So essentially the market economy, while it may have expanded opportunities for people and jobs in some ways, for a lot of select people, they were not able to have the opportunity to actually capitalize on that. The last part I'm going to talk about is women. So sort of in response to all these women starting to work in factories, there's this belief of cult of domesticity. It's actually kind of switched from Republican motherhood, like it comes from Republican motherhood, but essentially the cult of domesticity is trying to shield the woman in the home from the economy. And when men come home, they're coming home to something else besides worrying about their work and the economy. Remember, Republican motherhood was something similar. Like, woman, you don't need to be a part of this government. However, stay at home and teach your sons how to be a part of this government, and that's how you'll contribute. So cult of domesticity tried to capitalize on this word virtue for women. I think this picture like really highlights that. The ideal role for a woman is to be at home, to be virtuous, to take care of her sons and her husbands. And they promoted things like sexual innocence, beauty, frailty. She's too dang fragile to work in a factory, and she is dependent on her husband. She cannot go out and work on her own and make her own money. It solidified this idea that the private sphere, the home, is the woman's role. So women were already not given political freedom. And now, once they were starting to get economic freedom, this social construct of the cult of domesticity came into place to take away the economic freedom that women are given. That being said, if you were a woman who was lower class, an immigrant perhaps, or middle class, immigrant perhaps, or even a woman who is a slave, the cult of domesticity doesn't apply to you. Most of the time, these women had to work jobs, and literally in order to survive for their family. But the idea was they're working these jobs for their family, not for themselves. And this job is simply to take care of her children and her husband. So this idea of like workers' economic freedom for women is kind of a sham as well during the market revolution. And women had very little career movement if they were working. Okay, hopefully this recorded well. I don't know, I'm praying. I don't want to have to do this again. And make sure you're pausing and taking some good notes. See you later.